Over the last 15 years, I've helped more than 1,000 American families retire. And across all those families, all those conversations and plans, I noticed the same thing again and again. The families with the best retirements didn't always have the most money, but they all did four things differently. So in today's video, I'm going to show you what those four things are. Some of them are going to challenge what you think matters most about retirement. One of them has almost nothing to do with money at all. But all of them come from patterns I've seen play out hundreds of times with real families making real decisions. And if at any point during this video you want help seeing if this applies to your situation, I've included a link in the description to schedule a conversation. Let me tell you a story. Early in my career, I was working with a couple that had recently retired. They had done everything right, saved aggressively for 30 years, they had over $3 million, no debt, and a healthy amount of Social Security benefits. On paper, they were at the top tier of every retirement readiness metric you could think of. But 6 months into retirement, the husband told me he was having a hard time adjusting. He had had a long, successful career. His team needed him. He had purpose. He had a full calendar, a reason to get up in the morning. Now, he wasn't worried about money. He was worried about who he was without his job. And his wife was frustrated because she had a list full of things she was excited to do together. It was the first time I saw it, but it was far from the last. I started noticing that the families with the smoothest retirements didn't always have the biggest balances. They were the ones that had something to retire into. They already thought about what their days would look like, and not a vague, we want to go to the beach or go to the travel, but they'd given some real thought to it. They had relationships outside of work. They had hobbies or volunteer work, something that would give them a sense of purpose. And the ones that hadn't given that much thought, regardless of how much money they had, they were the ones that always struggled the most. I use this concept now that I call the clients Second Tuesday. The excitement of the first week has worn off. Maybe you've gone through your honey to-do list. It's Tuesday morning. What does that day look like? Who are you spending time with? If you can't answer that, the money doesn't matter nearly as much as you think it does. The financial plan is the infrastructure, but the infrastructure needs something to support. And the families who have that figured out live the most fulfilling retirements. Which brings me to the second thing I learned. And this took me years to fully understand because it goes against everything you'd expect. But when you help enough families retire, you start to notice a pattern that nobody talks about. The people who were best at saving the money during their working years were often the worst at spending it in retirement. And I don't mean they were a little cautious. I mean they had more than enough and still wouldn't allow themselves to enjoy it. I worked with a couple last year, both retired, plenty saved, Social Security and a pension covered most of their regular expenses. They had plenty to go out to dinner, to travel, help their grandkids, do the things that they had been talking about for years. They had been retired for 2 years when we first met, but they weren't allowing themselves to enjoy their retirement. They hadn't gone on any trips yet. They were worried about the price of going out to dinner. They weren't being careful. They were trapped. 30 years of saving had created an identity around saying no. And that identity didn't just disappear because a spreadsheet said they could say yes. Researchers at the Retirement Income Institute actually studied this and found that retirees on average spend 80% of their guaranteed income, so income from things like Social Security and their pension. But when it comes to their savings, they're only spending half of what they could spend responsibly. The common guideline is 4%. So on $1 million, instead of spending $40,000 a year, they were spending closer to $20,000. And the cost of that isn't just financial. It's trips that never happened. It's the grandkids' education fund that kept getting pushed off. It's years of freedom that got treated like scarcity instead. The saving discipline that helped them build everything they had was now getting in the way of them enjoying it. If you spent your whole life getting rewarded for restraint, retirement is going to feel unnatural, asking you to do something differently. And the families who figured out how to make this transition, even gradually, even if imperfectly, finally were able to enjoy what they had worked so hard to save. If you're watching this and beginning to wonder if some of these patterns apply to your situation, I help people with exactly this kind of thing every day. I've put a link in the description to schedule a conversation. But even the families who figured out how to enjoy their money, most of them were still making this one mistake that was costing them more than they realized. Early in my career, I gave the same advice that many advisors give. Spend from your brokerage account first, leaving your IRA untouched and let it grow. It made intuitive sense, and it's what every textbook says to do. But after watching this play out across hundreds of families, I began to see the problem. I had a couple who'd been retired for 7 years. They had followed this exact approach. Their brokerage account was almost gone, and their IRA had grown quite nicely. From the surface, that looks like a win. But when we actually looked at the numbers, the picture looked different. For 7 years, they had been pulling out capital gains and qualified dividends from their brokerage account. That income already gets favorable tax treatment. Most of it was taxed at 0 or 15%. Meanwhile, their deductions and lowest tax brackets basically went unused. That is the most valuable tax real estate you have as a retiree, and they had burned through it at income that was already taxed at a low rate. Now, their brokerage account was nearly depleted, and their IRA had grown larger than ever. So now as they started to take income from the IRA, every dollar was going to get taxed as ordinary income with very little flexibility to manage it. I think about it like walking into a store and using a 50% off coupon on the cheapest item in your shopping cart. That's what the conventional approach does. IRA withdrawals are the more expensive item. They get taxed at ordinary income rates that currently range from 10 all the way up to 37%. But the standard advice says to save your IRA withdrawals for later when you may not have as many deductions available to soften the blow. And that wasn't the only conventional piece of wisdom I saw backfire. I've seen families leave 6 figures on the table because they waited until age 70 to collect Social Security without running the numbers. I've seen people chase dividend income for the safety and end up with a larger tax bill and less growth for a 30-year retirement than they needed. None of these people were being reckless, and that's exactly what made it so expensive. The families who came out ahead questioned the default and built a plan specific to their situation and not some generic rule of thumb. And that brings me to the last lesson I learned, and honestly, it might be the most important one. After 15 years and 1,000 families, I've seen every kind of retirement. Smooth ones, rocky ones, ones that got hit by things that nobody could have predicted. And the one thing that separated the families that got through it with the families that didn't had nothing to do with the amount of money. It was whether or not they had a plan. And I don't mean a binder sitting on a shelf. I mean a living, breathing, actionable strategy that they could use when things got hard. I was working with a couple, and we were living through a significant market downturn. Their portfolio had dropped several $100,000 in a matter of a few weeks. When we got on the phone, I could hear the fear in their voice. They wanted to sell everything. They wanted to go to cash and wait it out. But we pulled up their plan, showed them that we had already accounted for this scenario. We had 5 years of their living needs protected from market volatility in high quality investments, things like cash, high quality bonds, CDs. Their growth investments didn't need to be touched. Their income was covered, and the plan was on track even with the recent drop. That conversation lasted about 20 minutes. By the end of it, they were calm. Not because the market had recovered, it hadn't, but they could see that they had already planned for this moment. Compare that to another family I spoke with that didn't have a plan in place. Similar portfolio size, similar drop, but they had no framework for the decision. They sold near the bottom, went to cash, and by the time they felt comfortable getting back into the market had already recovered most of its losses. That decision cost them years of growth that they couldn't get back. Same portfolio size, same market, same drop, completely different outcome. And the only difference was one family had a plan and the other didn't. Fidelity just released their 2026 State of Retirement Planning Study. They found that people with a written plan were twice as confident in their financial security as those without. And that gap held across different income and wealth levels. 83% versus 38%. I wasn't surprised by that at all. I've been watching that play out firsthand for over 15 years. I use this analogy with clients all the time. You look at a cockpit with a pilot. There are 50 buttons and levers in front of you. You have no idea which ones matter, but the pilot does. A good plan is the same thing. It helps you identify the 2 or 3 things that matter most for your specific situation and gives you a framework for answering them, especially when things get emotional. The families who thrived in retirement all had that, not because it kept bad things from happening, but when they happened, they already knew what to do. Those are the 4 things I've seen that have separated the families who thrived in retirement from those that struggled. It's one thing to notice those patterns, but to see those patterns applied to real numbers is completely different. I made a video where I walk through a full retirement plan for a couple with $2 million saved. Their actual expenses, income sources, tax strategy, and what their projections look like. If you want to see how this all comes together for a real situation, that's the video to watch next. I'll see you over there.